Welcome to this month's IQ Academy webinar. We're going to be taking a look at the health and safety considerations during design and implementation of quarry restoration with Simon Higson, Technical Director of SLR Consulting. And I'll now hand you over to Simon.
My name is Simon Higson. I'm a Chartered Landscape Architect, a member of the Institute of Quarrying and Technical Director with SLR Consulting. I've been working with SLR for the last 15 years and had 5 years with Higson Aggregates. Before that, doing in-house restoration work. Today's presentation is really drawing on that experience as a safety share. Briefly about SLR, we're multidisciplinary environmental consultancy. You can see our distribution with offices and staff just in the slide there. Probably about a quarter of our workload is mining and minerals related, and we have quite a number of teams within the business. And as I say, I'm a landscape architect, but I've worked on this presentation with colleagues from our geotechnical engineering and civil engineering specialists. So yeah, so safer by sharing. Really, the aim is just to share our experiences of providing support, and in particular the restoration phases of quarrying. So restoration design to reduce hazard and risk, whether that's landform, surface features, land cover, habitats, water bodies, and then after uses, so ecology, agriculture, forestry, recreation, waste, built environment type after uses, but then also to think about management of those construction and landscaping works, again, to reduce hazard and risk. So, typically earthworks, soils, compaction, cultivation, seeding, planting, fencing, etc. As a starting point, the National Planning Policy Framework requires mineral planning authorities, when considering mineral extraction proposals, to ensure that there are no unacceptable adverse impacts on other things, human health or aviation safety, and that there's provision for restoration and aftercare at the earliest opportunity and to the highest environmental standards. And so that policy is transferred into local plans and decision making by authorities, and all of the mineral workings quarries have a planning permission to work, and that planning permission will either specifically mention a restoration scheme, or there will be a condition attached to the permission that says the site needs to be restored in accordance with a scheme to be prepared, to be submitted and agreed. Safe quarry as a resource, again, is worth mentioning. So specifically for the minerals products industries, and there's all sorts of information about quarries and safety at that site. I thought it was worth reviewing in terms of, thinking about restoration phases, but in particular the fatal six that's mentioned, and the common themes of contact with moving machinery, workplace transport, pedestrian interface, working at height, workplace silica struck by moving or falling objects, and road traffic accidents. It seems that even during restoration phases that those could still apply, particularly transport, pedestrian. And then swimming in water bodies in quarries will come up later as another one, possibly specific for restoration or disused sites. Health and safety legislation, again, just to touch on this. So the HSE website with the link below covers all general health and safety at work legislation, but in particular risks in quarries, and there's the code of practice and the quarry regulations there. And again, that's really been used in this presentation out to the scope today. So reclamation sites, extraction of minerals is forming part of the process, and the site is being restored for agriculture or industrial or domestic use. That's covered under the quarry regulations. The guidance note says, quarries being prepared for abandonment, for example, landscaping, or where a quarry is no longer used, the site must be left in a safe condition when the quarrying work finishes. And tips used in conjunction or connection with the quarry are also covered by the regulations, even if it's just waste or landscaping materials. So it's clear that restoration is covered by these things and needs to think about these things. It's helpful, and in preparing this presentation, I wanted to frame it with the regulations in mind. So there's reference here as to what the operator needs to consider. So geotechnical features, the proximity of homes and footpaths where the public are likely to be, presence of watercourse and services, traffic routes, pedestrian safety, building tips, the use of plant and machinery. And again, we'll come on to those in the next couple of slides. Restoration planning, design, implementation. It's a complicated, multidisciplinary sort of team approach. Health and safety is one thing that we're going to talk about today, but actually there's lots of other considerations and input from specialists, whether that's the geotechnical engineers, or it may be ecologists or soils. It may be the public generally, the local planning authority, the landowner or adjacent landowners, as well as the ops and the project management side. Geotechnical features, as mentioned in the regs, so excavations of the quarry and how do we restore that, and then the tips, and that might include overburden and solid tips, but also lagoons as well. And the regs is clear that geotechnical engineers need to be involved and to consider the properties and the structures, both of slopes, but also faces, benches, and the crest and toe, face angles, etc. So in terms of not just the quarry, but the restoration phases, we need to consider long-term stability as well. So not just while it's operational, but as the site is abandoned and handed over to a beneficial use, what's the long-term stability? So that's considering circular failure, raveling, erosion of slope. There may be circular failure, sliding failures. Again, thinking about the long term and the characteristics, wedge failures, toppling failures. And so how do those situations, how does that, is that considered as part of the final restoration scheme? What things do we need to take into account? Lagoons, again, if there's a retaining or a dam wall, if that fails, again, in the long term, consideration of that, and then the surface of the lagoon itself in terms of stability, and how that thing might, those things may change as well over time or during the seasons. There's mitigation during the working, may include edge protection, rock traps, buttressing of slopes, traffic management, scaling, and it may be that actually restoration phase as well, those are incorporated into the scheme as a whole. So the design coming out of analysis will be heights of slopes and faces, position and bent and widths of benches from an engineer. How's the groundwater, the surface water going to behave from a hydrologist? And how the after use is the activities either on the floor or around the boundaries are influencing the design. So in this particular example, we're looking towards an exposed rock face. And then on the right-hand side of the view, the face has been buttressed and covered over with material, and soil has been spread over the bottom and grassed. And so we may say that, in health and safety terms, perhaps the reason why the buttressing on the right of the view was because there was a footpath at the top, or there was something sensitive that we wanted to reduce the risk of having the exposed faces on that side. But on where we have got the exposed faces, perhaps there isn't a footpath, or there isn't something beyond there, and therefore it was less of a risk to have that open. And so that sort of thought process and that discussion within the team would help to identify what material goes where and what's considered more important or more of a risk. So hard rock faces, sort of final restoration blasting is often considered and put on the table as an option, particularly in invisible sites, or a national hard rock quarry in a national park, which is quite visible. The idea being that the production faces are broken up, and the regular banding, the appearance of a quarry is reduced. It becomes a more naturalistic hillside. The disadvantages and the health and safety considerations on this is that treatments where there isn't the space to have these more naturalistic faces or restoration treatments, particularly again if you're trying to deepen the site and you're working a reserve, then it may be that actually this is a sequence here. The first bit, it would be the first bench. The step 2 would be to place material against the worked out bench. Once you're at the boundary, step 3 would take the next bench down, then placing material again, and then the next bench down. And this is a more controlled way of delivering some restoration whilst minimizing the land take. So it's the disadvantage, and again within a multidisciplinary discussion, you've got the appearance of a more regular banding. It's more obvious that it's a quarry. Well, if the quarry's hidden, then that might not be a problem, and that might be okay with the stakeholders, the planning authority. As the trees grow, you can see on this photograph, as those trees grow, that banding will become less apparent, particularly once they've reached the next layer up. And so it may only be a temporary thing of visual consideration as well. And the advantage is with this, the rock traps are all remain in place. Regulations, as I said before, talked about the proximity of homes, which is, and just to sort of think about that for a moment. So the aerial photo at the top is taken from Google Earth, actually, which is great because you can go back in time. But that shows the restored hard rock quarry and the old village on the boundary just to the west of it. And the photograph shows some of the old properties at the top. So, the quarry was operational. It went up fairly close to the nearby settlement. And the restoration scheme established grassland and woodland in the bottom. If you then look at the aerial photo below, you can see that since the site was restored, new housing, the village has grown, so new housing development has expanded around the northern and eastern side of the quarry. So that's something that can't be controlled as part of the restoration process, but it raises questions like, did the restoration scheme consider that there might be future housing in that direction, or did it always assume that there would be fields and therefore the risk would be different, the treatment might be different? Did the housing development consider that there was a quarry there and quarry faces, and how were those hazards and risks taken into account? So there are questions there. And the other situation that I was reminded of was, this is off the BBC News website. So there was a housing development that had been put into the bottom of a quarry as part of a built environment restoration. It's not one of our jobs, but we'd seen the news reports. And after heavy rain, there was a landslide of the quarry faces, and the gardens were buried in mud, as reported. And there were no injuries, and the houses are still there. But clearly, there's in putting housing development either at the top or at the bottom of faces, there does need to be consideration of long-term stability, what the hazards and risks are, and mitigation measures. The regs talk about, as part of restoration, diverted footpaths may be reinstated through parts of the site, quite often with rights of way that the local authority will want it back on the same route. And of course, the landscape will have changed, even after it's restored and soil's been spread in the bottom of a working or an excavation or over a tip. There may be some new hazards in faces and slopes that weren't there before. And so how do we manage that as part of restoration? Do we have fencing or signage, or do we have some other features? Barriers themselves are covered under the quarry regulations again, and there's requirement around the boundaries, properly maintained, suitable for discouraging trespass. Or as we move into the restoration phases, should those requirements change? Well, I've spoken to planning authorities that have said they want the old palisade quarry fencing removed because they want a more country park feel, and so they want timber fencing. And so there may be a risk assessment and a discussion to be had whether that's appropriate or not, depending on the state of the site and the considered risks. In terms of tips, again, design coming out of analysis, which is the key theme. What does the geotechnical engineer say? How much material have we got? What's the area of land that's going to be covered? What's the maximum height? What sort of gradients will be stable in the long term? Again, the hydrologist will come in and talk about surface water and runoff and those considerations, and we'll be blending those ideas about after use and the activities on the slopes around the boundaries, how the tip appears in terms of its skyline and profile in relation to other hills as part of the design. Restoration, so Quarry Lagoons, again, the key theme being design coming out of analysis. So that's, input from a geotechnical engineer on the construction of the walls or structures that are retaining the tip of lagoons, groundwater, surface water variations, and how that might influence the character of that part of the site from a hydrologist. After use and activities, if it's a wetland complex, maybe silting into part of it or all of it, forming a more variable margins and habitats within the water body. Or it may be a dry cover system, so spreading material over the top just to stabilize that surface with different sort of capping layers and soils to support vegetation and integrate into the landscape. Dangers of swimming, again, worth within this topic, worth noting the MPA have the safe campaign. Quarry lakes, 5 fatalities each year on average. Members of the public in disused sites. So, the Stay Safe campaign provides education and raises it as an issue with local communities. And that sits alongside, the site-specific management of risks and monitoring and barriers and fencing, etc. The water body design can contribute to that as well. So that may be the design of the shelves to create safer margins. So, a shallow slope or a margin would be safer than a steeper slope where people might get into difficulties and struggle to get out. And variable edges will improve aesthetics as well, ecological value. So that would sit alongside, ensuring there's good access for the emergency services if they needed to get to that part of the site. Maybe life buoys, scramble nets, warning signs, demarcation as well within the water itself. And then thinking about aviation safety, which is obviously mentioned within the National Planning Policy Framework. So this is the threat or the risk of aircraft colliding with large birds or large flocks of birds, and what an appropriate mitigation approach would be. So the MPA again has got some good guidance on this. And in particular, that talks about the restoration design, how landscaping habitat creation management can manage the risk. This is along other interventions within the bird management plan. Again, the restoration design can do certain things, and the guidance talks about how, the higher hazard is a large area of open water, whereas the lower hazard is a smaller, where you've got steep banks with scrub, fringing reed beds, wet woodland, smaller water bodies, no islands. So the image on the left is one of our drawings where we had it would have been a large body of water, but through the use of overburden and pushing up clay from the floor, we were able to create causeways and just to break up that large body of water really, and plant it up with woodland and just to enclose it. That those sites are only aviation safety sites are identified during the planning process, and it's only within safeguarding areas of airports or a certain location. So it's not all wetland restoration sites have this particular constraint or consideration. So just to move on to the physical work of doing the construction or the landscaping, and really just to mention that things can happen at that stage. So having risk assessments and method statements before works commence, ensuring competency and that there's a sufficient number of competent persons available to do the work, making sure there are quarry rules in place and that are understandable, and that it's constantly being reviewed and monitored to ensure that things are being done as safely as possible. And as an example, this was December 2018. A contracting firm was fined after a tipper driver fatally injured when his truck overturned on a stockpile. So the works were raising the ground levels using reuse of spoil from site. So effectively restoration work, and the HSEs within AgNet provided a report and recommendations. And so that's essential reading really to make sure that we're considering this when we review risk assessments and organise work. Mobile plants again with restoration, there might be big dozers either pulling compactors or tines for decompaction afterwards with an agricultural restoration. But again, September 2019, groundworks firm fined for safety failings. So a plant driver requested the assistance of a security guard working for a separate company to remove a trailer from a bulldozer while the machine was operated by the driver. And during this operation, and so just another example really from AgNet, September 2019, groundworks firm fined for safety failings. In particular, a plant driver requested the assistance of a security guard working for a separate company to remove a trailer from a bulldozer whilst the machine was operated by the driver. During the operation, the security guard's right hand became trapped. So again, the sort of thing that might happen during a restoration or a landscaping piece of work. The HSE helpfully provides a commentary and a report and recommendations. Make sure we're assessing the risks, make sure we've got control measures to minimise those risks from machinery. Again, the Quarry Regs specifically talks about presence of services, so that's overhead lines, but also buried services. It provides figure 9 is taken from the Code of Practice, which sets out how we protect vehicles. The bottom left photo doesn't have that protection in place, so and that was moving soil from one part of a site to another part. February 2020, you'd think this was fairly standard, but again, an example where a firm's fined following overhead power cable strike. So it's important that managers are thinking about these, making the right sort of risk assessments and putting the right provisions in place, precautions in place. So pedestrian safety, so yeah, again, and sort of fairly key one for SLR in particular. So our consultants will visit sites, operational sites or restored sites, and we'll quite often be walking around. And so what's suitable PPE do we need to consider? What the traffic is happening, what the works or other activities nearby, nature of the ground, works proposed, would be signing in and checking in with the manager just to find out the latest information. But, for example, full PPE on the left-hand photograph, full orange, a white helmet, and then, you can see the earthworks plant at the right-hand side of the photo. So, that's clearly operational. The bottom right photo, newt trapping within a non-operational part of the site this time. So clearance in advance of entering areas. So the PPE may be different in that situation. Obviously, there are gloves handling sort of animals and high visibility. And again, the PPE and the arrangements at the top right. So this is a aftercare site. It's been we've got slopes, buttress slopes, agriculture in the bottom, and then tree planting, and there's inter-row trimming between that planting area. And the PPE in that situation is a hard hat, face guard, gloves. But again, as the sites move into the restoration phases, the hazards change. Although it's interesting, and again, sort of this idea of review and monitor and share, really, safety by sharing. So I was walking over a restored site recently, stood on a metal piece of rebar that was poking out of the soil. It went up through the side of my welly and sock, didn't puncture the skin, and there was no injury, no pain as such. So reported it as a near miss on our system. But it was it was a restored site. It had been regraded and soiled. I've been going down there for a couple of years with the full PPE and steel toe cap boots and midsole. But it had gone beyond that. It was now into a new phase where it was having tree planting and aftercare with an aspiration or a thought of it'll go to the public, etc. So again, it's an interesting thought for us. What's the correct PPE? At what point do we change? And we make those changes and say it's okay to walk around or to access with certain clothing or a certain way. And I mean, for that one, we're going to go back and do a sort of a metal detecting and a check over to see if there's any other metal poking out anywhere else. But again, we had a conversation with a colleague, and they said, they'd done something similar and stood on a piece of timber, and that had punctured their footwear as well, a sort of a timber stake. And of course, that wouldn't be picked up with a metal detector. So the purpose of today and the webinar today was just to share our experiences and to say, we think about this all the time. It's constantly evolving, and we want to work with colleagues in the industry and be as safe as possible, really. And that's just our safety scheme. Okay, well, thank you very much, and I hope that's been interesting. And happy to discuss any thoughts or feedback on the webinar today. Thank you.
Thanks for taking the time to join us today, Simon. Any queries out of today's session, you can either drop Simon a line direct with his details that are shown on screen now, or alternatively email us at mail@quarrying.org, Reminder to also subscribe to the IQ YouTube channel. The address for that is just showing on the screen now. We host all of our past webinars and other CPD content on there, so it's a great resource to delve into. Thanks again for joining us, and hope to see you again next time.